Alexander Fleming was born on August 6, 1881, on Lochfield Farm near Darvel in Ayrshire in Scotland, a remote, rugged region of moors and hills where farming was hard and life was harder. He was the seventh of 8 children born to Hugh Fleming, a farmer who had married late in life and who would die when Alexander was just 7 years old. His mother, Grace Morton, was Hugh's second wife, 30 years younger, strong-willed and practical, who kept the farm running after her husband's death and raised her children with a combination of Scottish Presbyterian discipline and genuine affection. Young Alec, as the family called him, grew up on the farm doing chores, attending the local parish school, roaming the moors, and developing an intimate knowledge of nature that would later serve him well as a scientist. The farm was isolated. The nearest town was miles away, and life revolved around the rhythms of agriculture and the changing seasons. But it wasn't an intellectually barren environment. The Fleming children were educated, encouraged to read, and expected to make something of themselves despite their modest circumstances. At age 11, Alec left the farm to attend Kilmarnock Academy, living with his older brother Thomas in nearby Kilmarnock. 2 years later, he moved to London to join his older brother John, who had established himself as an optician and ophthalmologist. In London, Alec attended the Regent Street Polytechnic School for 2 years, receiving a solid commercial education that was supposed to prepare him for work in business or trade. At 16, he took a job as a clerk at a shipping office in the City of London, not a glamorous position, but steady work with prospects for advancement. For 4 years, Fleming worked as a shipping clerk, performing routine tasks in an office, seemingly destined for a thoroughly ordinary life in commerce. But he was restless, bored by the repetitive work, and intellectually unchallenged. He had no particular ambition to become a doctor or scientist. He simply wanted something more interesting than adding columns of figures and filing shipping manifests. Then, in 1901, 2 things happened that changed his trajectory. First, his uncle John Fleming died and left each of his nephews £250, a modest but significant sum that provided options Fleming hadn't had before. Second, his brother Thomas suggested he consider medicine. The suggestion wasn't entirely random. Thomas was doing well as an ophthalmologist, medicine was a respectable profession, and Alec had shown himself to be intelligent and capable. Moreover, Alec had recently served in a volunteer regiment, the London Scottish Regiment, where he discovered he enjoyed the camaraderie and physical activity of military training. Medical training would offer intellectual stimulation and a path to professional status that shipping clerkship never would. So in 1901, at age 20, Alexander Fleming took the entrance examination for medical school and passed with distinction. He could have attended any medical school in London, but he chose St. Mary's Hospital Medical School in Paddington for a characteristically practical reason. He had played water polo against their team and thought it would be a good place to continue playing sports. At St. Mary's, Fleming proved to be an excellent student, not brilliant in the showy way, not someone who dazzled with theoretical insights, but thorough, careful, observant, with a gift for practical work. He excelled particularly in the laboratory portions of his studies, showing a talent for bacteriology and pathology. His manual dexterity was exceptional. Years later, colleagues would marvel at his technique in handling bacterial cultures, his ability to work with tiny amounts of material, his precision in laboratory procedures. He graduated in 1906 with distinction, winning nearly every available prize and scholarship. After graduation, Fleming could have become a practicing physician, going into general practice or specializing. But Almroth Wright, the brilliant and eccentric head of St. Mary's inoculation department, convinced Fleming to join his research team. Wright was working on vaccines and immunology, trying to develop preventive treatments for infectious diseases. He offered Fleming a position as a research assistant, poorly paid but intellectually exciting, doing original research rather than routine medical practice. Fleming accepted, beginning a career in research that would last nearly 50 years and would change medicine forever. But Fleming's early research career was interrupted by World War I. In 1914, when war broke out, Fleming was commissioned as a captain in the Royal Army Medical Corps and sent to France, where he worked in battlefield hospitals treating wounded soldiers. The experience was traumatic and formative. Fleming saw thousands of soldiers die not from their wounds but from infections, tetanus, gangrene, septicemia. He watched helplessly as minor wounds became infected, as seemingly healthy young men deteriorated and died from bacterial invasions that spread through their bodies. The standard treatment for infected wounds was antiseptics, strong chemicals like carbolic acid that were supposed to kill bacteria. But Fleming observed that antiseptics often did more harm than good. They killed bacteria on the surface of wounds, but couldn't penetrate deep tissue where bacteria were actually multiplying. Worse, they damaged the body's own defenses, white blood cells, and natural healing mechanisms, making infections worse rather than better. Fleming conducted experiments showing that antiseptics actually increased mortality in deep wounds by destroying white blood cells while leaving bacteria in deep tissue untouched. Fleming published these findings in The Lancet in 1917, arguing that saline solution for cleaning wounds was superior to antiseptics for deep injuries. The medical establishment largely ignored him. Antiseptics were the accepted treatment, endorsed by authorities, and challenging conventional wisdom was professionally risky for a young researcher. But Fleming had seen the truth in the battlefield hospitals. Current treatments were inadequate, soldiers were dying unnecessarily, and better approaches were desperately needed. This experience, watching infection kill young men, seeing the failure of existing treatments, understanding that conventional medical wisdom was sometimes wrong, would drive his later research. After the war, Fleming returned to St. Mary's Hospital and resumed his research under Almroth Wright. The inoculation department was a unique institution, part research laboratory, part vaccine production facility, part medical practice. Wright ran it like a scientific republic, with regular meetings where research was discussed, debated, and criticized vigorously. Fleming thrived in this environment, conducting experiments, seeing patients, and slowly building a reputation as a skilled bacteriologist with unusual observational powers. In 1922, Fleming made his first important discovery, not penicillin, but lysozyme, an antibacterial enzyme found in human tears and other bodily secretions. The discovery came about accidentally, in a manner that would characterize Fleming's most famous discovery 6 years later. Fleming had a cold and was working in his laboratory when, in an unguarded moment, some of his nasal mucus fell into a bacterial culture dish. Days later, examining the culture, he noticed that bacteria had been killed around the spot where the mucus had landed. Instead of discarding the contaminated culture as most researchers would have done, Fleming was intrigued. What in nasal mucus could kill bacteria? Fleming conducted systematic experiments, testing tears, saliva, mucus, and other bodily fluids against various bacteria. He discovered that tears contained a substance that could dissolve certain bacteria. He called it lysozyme because it lysed, broke down bacteria. He isolated lysozyme from egg whites, where it was present in high concentrations, and studied its properties. It was an enzyme, a natural antibacterial substance produced by the body as part of the immune system. Fleming hoped lysozyme might be useful as a therapeutic agent, but it turned out to be effective mainly against harmless bacteria, not against the pathogenic bacteria that caused disease. So while lysozyme was scientifically interesting, it revealed that the body produced its own antibacterial substances. It had limited medical applications. But the lysozyme discovery was important for what it revealed about Fleming's approach to research. First, he noticed something unusual that others might have dismissed as contamination. Second, he systematically investigated the phenomenon rather than ignoring it. Third, he pursued the finding even though it contradicted conventional wisdom. Most scientists believed the body fought infection solely through white blood cells and antibodies, not through antibacterial enzymes. This combination of observational acuity, systematic investigation, and willingness to pursue unconventional findings would characterize all of Fleming's best work. Through the 1920s, Fleming continued his research at St. Mary's, working on various problems in bacteriology and immunology. He married Sarah Marion McElroy, an Irish nurse who worked at St. Mary's, in 1915, a happy marriage that would last until her death in 1949. They had one son, Robert, born in 1924. Fleming's life settled into a pattern: research during the day, discussions with colleagues, evenings at home with his family, and weekends often spent painting watercolors, a hobby he pursued with the same meticulous care he brought to bacteriology. Fleming's laboratory at St. Mary's was famously cluttered and disorganized, benches covered with culture dishes in various states of completion, experiments running simultaneously, materials piled haphazardly. His colleague V.D. Allison later wrote, "Fleming's laboratory was like a museum of interesting bacteria. Cultures which had served their purpose or had been abandoned were not destroyed but left on the bench, in incubators, or in other places." This untidiness, which drove some of his more fastidious colleagues to distraction, would prove crucial to his most famous discovery. Fleming wasn't a theorist or a brilliant experimentalist in the classical sense. He didn't design elegant experiments to test specific hypotheses, didn't develop sophisticated theories, didn't have the mathematical skills of a physicist or the chemical knowledge of a biochemist. What he had was extraordinary observational powers, the ability to notice small details that others missed, to recognize when something unexpected was significant, to see patterns in apparently random phenomena. This gift, developed perhaps during his childhood on the Scottish moors, where survival depended on noticing subtle signs in nature, would be perfectly suited to the discovery he was about to make. The story of penicillin's discovery has been told countless times, often embellished or simplified, but the essential facts are remarkable enough without embellishment. In the summer of 1928, Fleming was researching Staphylococcus, bacteria that cause boils, wound infections, and other ailments. He was growing bacterial cultures in Petri dishes, allowing them to develop, then examining them. Before leaving for a vacation in August, Fleming stacked some culture plates on his laboratory bench and left them. The lab had no air conditioning, and the windows were kept open in the warm weather. When Fleming returned in early September, he began examining the plates to see what had happened during his absence. Most of the plates showed bacterial growth as expected, but one plate caught Fleming's attention. It had been contaminated by a mold. Presumably, a spore had floated in through the open window and landed on the culture while it was still open. Mold contamination was common and usually meant the culture had to be discarded. But Fleming noticed something unusual. Around the mold growth, the Staphylococcus bacteria had been killed. There was a clear zone around the mold where no bacteria grew, as if the mold was secreting some substance that killed or inhibited bacterial growth. Fleming showed the plate to his assistant, D.M. Price, who happened to be in the lab. Price later recalled Fleming saying something like, "That's funny." Those two words, "that's funny," are perhaps the most important in the history of medicine, because instead of discarding the contaminated plate as any sensible researcher would have done, Fleming kept it. He recognized that this contamination was different, that it might tell him something important, that the pattern he was seeing, bacteria killed around the mold, wasn't random but significant. Fleming began investigating systematically. What kind of mold was it? How did it kill bacteria? What bacteria were affected? Could the mold's antibacterial substance be isolated and used medically? He identified the mold as belonging to the genus Penicillium. It was later identified specifically as Penicillium notatum, though there's still some debate about the exact species. He grew the mold in liquid cultures and found that the broth in which the mold grew acquired antibacterial properties. Whatever substance the mold was producing dissolved into the liquid and could kill bacteria even when diluted hundreds of times. Fleming tested this mold broth against various bacteria and made a crucial discovery. It was effective against gram-positive bacteria that caused many serious infections: Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, Pneumococcus, diphtheria bacillus, but not against gram-negative bacteria like those causing typhoid or cholera. This selectivity was important. The substance killed dangerous bacteria, but might be less toxic to human cells. Fleming also found that the mold broth was non-toxic to white blood cells and to animals. He could inject it into rabbits and mice without harmful effects. Fleming called the antibacterial substance penicillin. Simply the name of the mold, plus the standard suffix for biological substances. He wrote up his findings in a paper titled On the Antibacterial Action of Cultures of a Penicillium, with special reference to their use in the isolation of B. influenzae, published in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology in 1929. The paper described penicillin's antibacterial properties, its lack of toxicity, and its potential use as an antiseptic for treating infected wounds. It was a careful, thorough paper, but it didn't emphasize penicillin's revolutionary potential, didn't call it a miracle drug, didn't predict that it would transform medicine. Why not? Partly because Fleming was cautious by nature, unwilling to make grand claims without overwhelming evidence, but partly because he faced enormous practical challenges in developing penicillin as a drug. The mold broth lost its antibacterial activity after a few days. The penicillin was unstable, breaking down quickly. Isolating pure penicillin from the broth proved extremely difficult. The substance was present in tiny amounts, was chemically unstable, and Fleming lacked the chemical expertise and equipment to purify it. He couldn't produce enough penicillin to do extensive testing or clinical trials. And he couldn't interest chemists in helping him. Most thought the problem of isolating and purifying an unstable organic compound from mold broth was too difficult and not worth the effort. Fleming tried using penicillin as a topical antiseptic for infected wounds, applying the mold broth directly to infections. The results were mixed. Sometimes it seemed to help, other times it didn't. Because the penicillin was unstable and the concentrations variable, it was hard to get consistent results. Without being able to purify and standardize penicillin, Fleming couldn't do the systematic clinical trials that would be needed to prove it was effective. By the early 1930s, Fleming had largely given up on developing penicillin as a therapeutic drug, though he continued to use it in his laboratory as a tool for isolating certain bacteria. It would kill competing bacteria while leaving the bacteria he wanted to study unharmed. For more than a decade, penicillin remained a laboratory curiosity, known to bacteriologists who read Fleming's 1929 paper, but not developed or used clinically. Fleming mentioned it occasionally in lectures, kept his penicillin-producing mold alive by regularly transferring it to fresh cultures, and hoped that someday someone with the chemical expertise he lacked might take up the challenge of purifying and developing it. The discovery that would save millions of lives was sitting on a shelf at St. Mary's Hospital, waiting for the right people with the right skills to recognize its potential. While Fleming's penicillin discovery languished, the world was sliding toward another catastrophic war. In 1939, World War II began, and once again, battlefield wounds and infections would kill hundreds of thousands. But this time, there would be a dramatic intervention that would change military medicine and ultimately all of medicine. Penicillin would finally be developed into a practical drug. The breakthrough came not from Fleming, but from two researchers at Oxford University, Howard Florey, an Australian pathologist, and Ernst Chain, a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany. In 1938, Florey and Chain had begun a systematic study of antibacterial substances. They were interested in understanding how bacteria were killed by various natural substances, and whether any of these substances might be useful as drugs. While reviewing the scientific literature, Chain came across Fleming's 1929 paper on penicillin. He was intrigued by the description of a mold-produced substance that killed bacteria but was non-toxic to animals. Florey and Chain decided to investigate whether penicillin could be purified, produced in larger quantities, and developed as a therapeutic drug. They assembled a team including biochemist Norman Heatley and other researchers, obtained a culture of Fleming's Penicillium mold, and began the painstaking work of growing the mold, extracting penicillin from the broth, and trying to purify and stabilize it. The work was technically demanding. Penicillin was present in tiny amounts, was extremely unstable, and required careful chemical treatment to extract and purify without destroying it. But Florey and Chain had resources Fleming didn't have: a team of expert chemists, access to sophisticated equipment, and funding from the Rockefeller Foundation. More importantly, They had the chemical expertise to tackle the purification problem systematically. Norman Heatley developed innovative techniques for growing the mold in large quantities and for extracting penicillin from the culture fluid. Chain worked out chemical procedures for purifying the penicillin enough that it could be tested in animals. By 1940, the Oxford team had produced enough crude penicillin to test in mice. In a now-famous experiment, they infected 8 mice with lethal doses of Streptococcus bacteria, then treated 4 of them with penicillin while leaving 4 untreated as controls. The 4 untreated mice all died within 24 hours. The 4 treated mice all survived. It was dramatic proof that penicillin could cure bacterial infections in living animals. The results were published in The Lancet in August 1940, causing immediate excitement in the medical community. The next step was testing in humans. In February 1941, the Oxford team treated their first patient, a 43-year-old policeman named Albert Alexander, who had developed a severe infection from a scratch while pruning roses. The infection had spread, causing abscesses on his face and scalp, and he was dying. Conventional treatments had failed. The doctors administered penicillin, all the penicillin the Oxford team had been able to produce, carefully saved, and even recovered from the patient's urine, and repurified for reuse. The results were miraculous. Within 24 hours, the patient's fever dropped, the infection began to clear, and he started to recover. But the team ran out of penicillin before the infection was completely eliminated, and 5 days after treatment stopped, the patient relapsed and died. It was both a triumph and a tragedy. Penicillin clearly worked. It had brought a dying man back from the brink, but there wasn't enough of it. The Oxford team needed to produce penicillin on a much larger scale, needed industrial partners who could manufacture it in the quantities needed for widespread clinical use. This was early 1941. Britain was in the desperate early years of World War II, and industrial capacity was devoted to producing weapons, not drugs. British pharmaceutical companies were interested, but lacked the resources and capacity to scale up penicillin production during wartime. So Florey and Heatley traveled to the United States in June 1941, seeking American help in mass-producing penicillin. They met with officials at the U.S. Department of Agriculture's research laboratory in Peoria, Illinois, where scientists had expertise in large-scale fermentation, growing microorganisms in huge vats for industrial purposes. The Peoria laboratory became crucial to penicillin production. Researchers there discovered that a different nutrient medium, using corn steep liquor, a waste product from corn processing, dramatically increased penicillin yields. They also found new strains of Penicillium mold that produced much more penicillin than Fleming's original strain. After the United States entered World War II in December 1941, penicillin production became a military priority. The U.S. government funded research, encouraged pharmaceutical companies to develop production methods, and coordinated efforts to scale up manufacturing. By 1943, there was enough penicillin to treat all Allied soldiers who needed it. By 1944, production was sufficient for civilian use. The drug that Fleming had discovered in 1928 but couldn't develop was finally available, and it was saving thousands of lives. The successful development and mass production of penicillin created immediate questions about credit. Who deserved recognition for this revolutionary drug? Fleming had discovered it in 1928 but hadn't developed it into a usable medicine. Florey and Chain had purified it, tested it, and demonstrated its effectiveness, but had built on Fleming's discovery. The American researchers had solved the production problems, but wouldn't have known what to produce without the British work. How should credit be distributed? Initially, the press and public focused almost exclusively on Fleming. In August 1942, a London Times article described penicillin and credited Fleming as its discoverer. Fleming became an overnight celebrity, portrayed as the brilliant scientist whose accidental discovery was saving lives. The story was compelling. The Scottish farm boy, the contaminated culture plate, the observant scientist who noticed what others would have missed, the miracle mold. It was the kind of narrative the press and public loved, simple, dramatic, with a clear hero. Florey and Chain were upset by this coverage. They had done the difficult work of turning Fleming's discovery into a practical drug, had solved the chemical and production problems Fleming couldn't solve, and had conducted the clinical trials proving penicillin's effectiveness. Yet Fleming was getting all the credit while their contributions were barely mentioned. Florey, who disliked publicity and had deliberately avoided it, was particularly frustrated. He felt the emphasis on accidental discovery, and luck diminished the systematic scientific work that had been required to make penicillin usable. Fleming, for his part, didn't actively seek publicity and was somewhat uncomfortable with his celebrity status. But he also didn't vigorously correct the narrative or insist that Florey and Chain receive equal credit. He gave lectures about penicillin, received honors and awards, and became the public face of the penicillin story. His defenders argued that he had every right to be recognized. After all, he had made the initial discovery, had recognized its significance, had published his findings, and had kept the mold alive for a decade while hoping someone would develop it further. The Nobel Prize Committee, at least, recognized the multiple contributors. In 1945, Fleming, Florey, and Chain shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the discovery of penicillin and its curative effect in various infectious diseases. The prize citation acknowledged that Fleming had discovered penicillin, but that Florey and Chain had developed it into a useful drug. All three men received equal shares of the prize and gave Nobel lectures describing their work. It was a fair recognition of the collaborative nature of the achievement, though the public continued to focus primarily on Fleming. The question of credit for penicillin raises interesting issues about how scientific discoveries happen and how they are recognized. Was penicillin discovered in 1928 when Fleming noticed the contaminated plate, or in 1940 when Florey and Chain proved it could cure infections in mice, or in 1941 when it was first used successfully in humans? Is discovery finding something new, or is it making something useful? Can you claim credit for a discovery if you can't develop it to the point where it benefits humanity? Modern historians of science generally view the penicillin story as a collaborative achievement requiring multiple crucial contributions. Fleming's observational skill in noticing the contaminated plate and recognizing its significance. Fleming's initial characterization of penicillin's properties. Chain's rediscovery of Fleming's paper and decision to pursue it. Florey and Chain's chemical work purifying penicillin. Heatley's development of production methods. The American researchers' work on large-scale production, and many others' contributions at various stages. Each step was necessary, none alone was sufficient, but there's another dimension to the credit question. Fleming's observational skill in noticing the contaminated plate was genuinely remarkable. Most scientists, finding a contaminated culture, would have discarded it immediately without closer examination. Fleming noticed the pattern of bacterial inhibition around the mold, recognized it as potentially significant, and investigated it. This kind of serendipity, prepared minds recognizing the significance of unexpected observations, is central to many important discoveries. Fleming's contribution wasn't just luck. It was trained observational powers, combined with intellectual curiosity and willingness to investigate phenomena that conventional wisdom said were just contamination to be ignored. The impact of penicillin on medicine and human health cannot be overstated. Before penicillin, bacterial infections were major killers. Pneumonia, strep throat, infected wounds, scarlet fever, gonorrhea, syphilis, all could be fatal, and doctors could do little except provide supportive care and hope the patient's immune system would prevail. Childbirth was dangerous partly because puerperal fever, bacterial infection of the uterus after delivery, killed many new mothers. Minor scratches could become infected, leading to blood poisoning and death. Bacterial diseases killed millions annually, and there were no effective treatments. Penicillin changed this dramatically. By the late 1940s, infections that had been death sentences became curable. Pneumonia could be treated successfully with a few days of penicillin injections. Strep throat and scarlet fever became minor illnesses rather than potential killers. Wound infections that would have required amputation or caused death could be cured. Syphilis, which had been a devastating disease requiring years of toxic mercury or arsenic treatment with uncertain results, became curable with penicillin. Maternal mortality from puerperal fever plummeted. Life expectancy increased significantly, driven partly by the availability of antibiotics. But penicillin was just the beginning. Its success sparked the search for other antibiotics, substances produced by microorganisms that could kill bacteria. In 1943, streptomycin was discovered by Selman Waxman and his student Albert Schatz, providing an effective treatment for tuberculosis. Chloramphenicol, tetracycline, erythromycin, and other antibiotics followed in the 1940s and 1950s. The antibiotic era had begun, and bacterial diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia were suddenly conquerable. Fleming became an international celebrity and elder statesman of medicine. He received honorary degrees from dozens of universities, was knighted in 1944, and received honors from governments around the world. He traveled extensively, giving lectures about penicillin and antibiotics, meeting with scientists and political leaders, and basking in the acclaim. He was shy and somewhat awkward in public settings, but enjoyed the recognition and used his platform to advocate for medical research and international scientific cooperation. But Fleming also issued warnings that were largely ignored at the time, but proved prescient. In his Nobel Prize lecture in 1945, he warned about the danger of bacteria developing resistance to penicillin. He explained that bacteria could evolve resistance if exposed to non-lethal doses of antibiotics, and he cautioned against using penicillin carelessly or in insufficient doses. "The time may come," he said, "when penicillin can be bought by anyone in the shops. Then there is the danger that the ignorant man may easily underdose himself, and by exposing his microbes to non-lethal quantities of the drug, make them resistant." Fleming's warning was prophetic. By the 1950s, penicillin-resistant strains of Staphylococcus were appearing in hospitals. Over the following decades, antibiotic resistance became an increasingly serious problem. Overuse and misuse of antibiotics in medicine and agriculture created selective pressure favoring resistant bacteria. Today, antibiotic-resistant infections kill hundreds of thousands of people annually, and the development of new antibiotics hasn't kept pace with the evolution of resistance. Fleming foresaw this problem in 1945, but the medical community and public didn't heed his warnings until resistance had become widespread. Fleming's personal life in his later years was marked by both happiness and loss. His wife Sarah died in 1949 after a long illness. In 1953, at age 71, Fleming married Dr. Amalia Kautsauer-Iverikas, a Greek colleague and former student whom he had met years earlier. The marriage was happy, though brief. Fleming would die just 2 years later. He remained active in research and public life through his 70s, though his scientific contributions after penicillin's discovery were modest. He seemed content to be an ambassador for science and for penicillin, using his fame to promote medical research and international cooperation. On March 11, 1955, Alexander Fleming died suddenly of a heart attack at his London home. He was 73 years old. He was given a funeral service at St. Paul's Cathedral, an honor usually reserved for royalty and heads of state, and was buried in the crypt of St. Paul's, among Britain's most honored citizens. Tributes poured in from around the world, all emphasizing the millions of lives saved by his discovery of penicillin. Fleming's scientific legacy is straightforward. He discovered penicillin, the first widely used antibiotic, which revolutionized medicine and saved millions of lives. His discovery opened the antibiotic era, led to the development of numerous other antibiotics, and transformed bacterial diseases from major killers to treatable conditions. The impact on human health and longevity was enormous. Some historians argue that antibiotics, along with vaccines and improved sanitation, are among the most important public health advances in history. But Fleming's story also illustrates important lessons about scientific discovery. First, the role of serendipity. Fleming's discovery depended on a series of unlikely coincidences, the mold spore floating into his laboratory, landing on a culture plate at just the right time, producing penicillin in quantities sufficient to create a visible zone of bacterial inhibition. But serendipity alone wasn't enough. Fleming had to notice the unusual pattern, recognize its potential significance, and investigate it systematically. As Louis Pasteur famously said, "Chance favors the prepared mind." Fleming's mind was prepared by his years of bacteriological research, his experience with lysozyme, and his exceptional observational skills. Second, the difference between discovery and development. Fleming discovered penicillin but couldn't develop it into a practical drug. He lacked the chemical expertise, equipment, and resources to purify and produce penicillin in useful quantities. It took Florey, Chain, and their team to do that work. Many important discoveries require multiple stages: initial observation, characterization, development, production, and different people may be suited to different stages. The cult of the lone genius discoverer often obscures the collaborative, cumulative nature of scientific progress. Third, the importance of communication and publication. Fleming published his findings in 1929, making them available to other researchers. 11 years later, Chain found the paper, recognized its importance, and initiated the work that would turn penicillin into a useful drug. If Fleming hadn't published, if the paper had been rejected or ignored, the development of penicillin might have been delayed by years or decades, and millions more people would have died from bacterial infections. Scientific publication, even of findings that seem incomplete or not fully developed, is crucial for scientific progress. Fourth, the role of war in accelerating medical research. World War II created the urgency and resources needed to develop penicillin rapidly. The U.S. government's massive investment in penicillin production was driven by military necessity, the need to treat wounded soldiers, but the resulting drug benefited all of humanity. This pattern, military funding driving medical breakthroughs, has been repeated many times, raising complex questions about the relationship between war, science, and human welfare. The Fleming legend, the Scottish farm boy, the accidental discovery, the miracle drug, has been told so many times that it's become mythologized. But stripped of embellishment, Fleming's real story is remarkable enough. He was a careful, observant scientist who noticed something unusual, investigated it systematically, and published his findings even though he couldn't fully develop them. He kept the mold alive for years, hoping someone would solve the problems he couldn't solve. When penicillin was finally developed and mass-produced, he graciously shared credit with Florey and Chain while accepting his role as the public face of the discovery. Fleming wasn't a brilliant theorist, wasn't a skilled chemist, wasn't a charismatic leader or visionary thinker. He was a careful observer with exceptional attention to detail, someone who noticed what others overlooked, who recognized the significance of unexpected findings, and who pursued leads that seemed promising even when conventional wisdom suggested they were just contamination to be ignored. These qualities, observational acuity, intellectual curiosity, persistence, are often undervalued compared to theoretical brilliance or experimental virtuosity, but they're equally important to scientific progress. The mold that contaminated Fleming's culture plate in 1928, Penicillium notatum, is preserved at the British Museum. The original contaminated plate was lost or destroyed, but samples of Fleming's mold strain were preserved and are still maintained today. They're a tangible link to the moment when human medicine changed forever, when the power of antibiotics was first glimpsed, when a new era in treating bacterial disease began. Millions of people alive today owe their lives to antibiotics descended from Fleming's discovery. Every person who has been cured of pneumonia with penicillin, every mother who has survived childbirth without puerperal fever, every child who has recovered from strep throat without complications, every soldier whose infected wound has healed rather than leading to amputation or death, all are beneficiaries of that contaminated culture plate Fleming noticed in September 1928. But the story doesn't end happily. Antibiotic resistance, which Fleming warned about in 1945, has become one of the most serious challenges in medicine. Bacteria that were once easily killed by penicillin and other antibiotics have evolved resistance. Methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, MRSA, vancomycin-resistant enterococci, multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis, and other resistant bacteria cause infections that are difficult or impossible to treat. The World Health Organization has declared antibiotic resistance a global health crisis. Fleming's miracle drug is losing its effectiveness, and we're running out of new antibiotics to replace it. The antibiotic era that Fleming initiated may be coming to an end, or at least entering a new, more difficult phase. Pharmaceutical companies have largely abandoned antibiotic development because it's not profitable. Antibiotics are used for short periods, so they don't generate the revenue of drugs for chronic conditions. Regulatory hurdles for new antibiotics are high, and the evolution of resistance is so rapid that new antibiotics become less effective within years of introduction. We face the disturbing possibility of returning to a pre-antibiotic era where common infections are again potentially fatal. Yet Fleming's discovery remains one of the great achievements in medicine. For nearly a century, antibiotics have saved countless millions of lives, have made surgery safer, have transformed medicine. Even if antibiotic resistance eventually limits their effectiveness, even if we must find new approaches to fighting bacterial infections, the antibiotic era will be remembered as one of medicine's golden ages. And Alexander Fleming will be remembered as the observant scientist who noticed a contaminated culture plate, recognized that the pattern he saw was important, and pursued it far enough to show the world that molds could produce miracle drugs. In St. Paul's Cathedral, where Fleming is buried, there's a memorial tablet inscribed simply, Alexander Fleming, discoverer of penicillin. 7 words to commemorate a life, but those 7 words represent millions of lives saved, decades of medical progress, and the transformation of infectious disease treatment. The Scottish farm boy who became a shipping clerk, who almost didn't go into medicine at all, who might never have noticed that contaminated plate if he'd been less observant or more fastidious about cleaning his laboratory, that man changed the world. His legacy is every person who has been cured of a bacterial infection, every parent whose child has survived pneumonia, every soldier whose infected wound has healed. Fleming's contaminated culture plate may be lost, but its effects reverberate through every hospital, every pharmacy, every life saved by antibiotics. That's a legacy that needs no embellishment,